Chapter 6. The martyr sat in the pose of a Buddha without a lotus flower. His oil-rubbed skin set the deeply penetrated tan off with a subtle glow, and his thick dark hair was greased and the top half of it tied in a ponytail at the back of his head.
Makes you look more like a Champions League footballer than a high priest warrior.
Eva had told him the first time she'd seen him wear it that way.
أنا لست من تلك الأشياء.
He'd replied, which loosely translated from Arabic, which he'd chosen to speak in for a month as part of a process of purification, to, "I'm neither of those things."
You don't say.
She'd said with a smile more mocking than she'd intended it to be, and walked her right foot up his bare back. That was the first time he'd ever pushed her away. She watched him now, through the window of his quarters in the small garden oasis he'd created with the help of his believers. She dug her fingertips deep into the flesh of her arms and ran them down their length, murmuring slightly, always a lover of that strange, illicit periphery between pleasure and pain. The monks, his believers, were circumnavigating him as usual, their silly shaved heads bobbing about the grass like buoys on the water as they bowed and entreated to his greatness. Oh, please. Like any dutiful woman who likes to gratify her man, she'd gone to great lengths to find him a book on the history of spiritualism when he'd first started to ramble on about what he wanted to create. There wasn't much to choose from in the turkey cage. The turkey cage was what they'd come to call it. Officially, it was listed by the company as Area 36, a former set of 1960s summer chalets set around a sparse grassland. They'd been built as affordable holiday accommodation on the island but failed to attract mainlanders and had fallen into a state of neglect. Several decades later, they would come to provide an easy solution for the company as to where to accommodate the construction workers and project managers employed on the build of the luxury housing complex. Later, when their project ran aground, it became the ideal place to stick the overspill of vagabonds, drifters and emigrants that washed up like jetsam on Skidway's shores. Renaming the complex the Turkey Cage had come via an on-point joke made by her usually humorless and unsubtle cousin Luan. 6 families had been in the compound with them for a month before being spirited away to run a succession of businesses at the harbour. A month later, another 4 would be plucked from the compound's grim obscurity and speed-tracked into entrepreneurialism. When, finally, it was their turn, and they were handed the keys to the Codfather, Luan, Tariq and she packed up, and as a parting gesture, Luan turned to the accumulated faces of the miserable tenants left behind in the filth and, with a cheeky smile, had broadcast his message.
"We're off. They fattened us up for Christmas. See you turkeys later."
In truth, none of her family left. They could have easily taken up residence in the apartment above the newly renamed Skanderberg Café, but their friends were here. Tintin was here, and she'd promised she'd never leave him. But mostly, yes, mostly, he was here. She never really knew why he'd come. To most, he was just another wanderer, one of the world's rejects, destined to roam its waters until he could find some ragged crook or stone where he wasn't hated enough to be thrown out. For others, there was talk of legendary status over his background. He'd supposedly slain 2 security guards the very night she was brought over in an act of almost supernatural justice, or perhaps of pure red-blooded vengeance. It took some time for her head to acclimatise from the insanity of her arrival on the island. And then she found him. He was wandering around like a dazed lamb who'd survived a culling almost as much as she was. From there, lingering looks gave way to small snatches of conversation. No one would normally intimidate this wolf baby, but there was something about him. He did. Finally, when the sexual tension from all the other inhabitants of the turkey cage had become stifling as summer, Luan had thrown down his cards in a game of poker and bellowed at him.
"Will you just fuck my cousin and be done with it?"
With that, permission was given out. And well, it would have been rude not to. Tariq refused to speak to either of them for the following week. 3 months on, and the martyr was born. He'd been teaching a few of the teenagers Taekwondo for several weeks, and supposedly it was divine calling. But she knew he just liked being a rock star. But aiming to please, she'd set out to find something to enhance his studies, something to make him smile. She'd had to pickpocket the paperback, Lessons from a Higher God, from the Harbour Bookstore, the Moby Dickens. Oh, you crazy Brits. He'd sat up the whole night reading it, poring over every detail the way men from her country pored over car parts when they got their first Trans Am. She soon began to regret the stolen contribution to his mystic journey. The chapter on Chudakarana Samskara in the religion of Hinduism was of note. Both Hindu boys and girls undergo a ritual at about 4 years old in which they have their heads shaved. Hair is an adornment, so by shaving the head, the child confronts his or her bare ego. It teaches humbleness and devotion. Children with shaved heads are innocent and holy and are treated with great respect. Shaving the head can also be an act of humility for adults. For example, at the Kumbh Mela, the first ritual observed by most pilgrims is the Mundana ceremony, the shaving of the head. Hair is considered the symbol of vanity, and to receive the full benefits of a pilgrimage to a holy place, one must first give up vanity. Thus, the pilgrims believe that their hair should be shaven from the head in a gesture of surrender.
All very nice.
She'd said as he recited the passage to her.
But don't be shaving yours.
She ran her hand through it and gripped a firm fistful, giving it a powerful tug and biting his ear.
Gives me something to hang on to.
She could tell he'd wanted to push her away then. She knew the way a woman knows, but he'd resisted. That first and most wounding of rejections would come a few weeks later when she'd pushed him that 1 inch too far. By that point, all his believers were bald-headed and entranced, and she decided to start a religion of her own. That night at dinner, after exercise and prayers, the martyr joined them to find Luan and several of the most machine-like, brutal and savage of the men in the turkey cage sporting bare-skinned scalps. He barged into her room and confronted her viciously, pushing her angrily up against the wall, demanding she explain why the need to make a mockery of all he stood for. She murmured in what felt like ecstasy at his fierce words, his hands around her throat stretching forward to breathe in the scent of him.
I want to see you one last time. Kiss your smile. Smell your handsome.
He banged her heavily into the wall, so hard she moaned.
I'll slip a poison in both our cups till we choke and spit. I'd rather die alongside you than ever let you go.
Finally, he turned for the door only to find she'd locked it and hidden the key. When he turned around to her, she was leant back in a chair, its 2 front legs off the floor. With both hands under the rim of her skirt, and the way she was sinking her teeth so hard down on her bottom lip that blood arose, he'd first thought she was pleasuring herself. But when blood also arose in dots on her skirt's white cotton, he'd snatched back the layers to find Luan's straight razor in her hand and her pubic hair being hacked unceremoniously from the tender skin of her labia majora. He prized the razor out of her hands, but her femininity was already stripped bare, other than a few stray tufts and crisscrosses of unsightly gashes. She looked up at him with the innocence of a child.
I want us both to be clean when we ascend into heaven.
Whether it was shock or the fact that there was just no other woman on earth like her, he did not know. But the martyr allowed her to control him that night. She guided him onto the bed like a thing with no being, no will of his own, no conscious thought. She straddled him and walked up the outside of his body on her knees until she was hovering over his neck, and from there bent her pelvis forward so he could kiss all the bloody places she had just desecrated. She snapped back from the memory of that night as the martyr got up on the grass outside. As he allowed each of his believers to kiss his outstretched hand, she pulled back her shirt to expose her bare, tanned shoulders and leant her long, lean legs up against his wall. He entered the room as if he did not see her. He undressed from his golden satin robe and kissed the eternal sun symbol on the long sash that formed his belt. Finally, he spoke, without looking round at her.
What do you want, Ava?
What do you want, Eva? What do you want, Eva? Do I always have to want something? Can't I just come over?
She took her legs from the wall, got up and sauntered over to him in her impossibly high heels. Ignoring her as best he could, he kissed the eternal sun symbol on the breast of his robes and folded them on the bed.
Still worshipping that patch of cotton on your tit. Once was a time you were worshipping me.
She walked her index and middle finger over his bare shoulder. His skin was smooth and still burnt bronze from last summer's sun. He immediately shrugged her away. Like a footballer making a dive, she allowed the gentle shrug to seemingly knock her onto his bed. She flicked back the tumble of hair that had fallen across her face.
Oh, looks like we've got a hero in our midst.
He turned back to see her lying beside that month's copy of the company newsletter. Its centre spread open to reveal the picture of Luke in full military dress under the headline, "War Hero to be honoured in this year's Champions of Britain Awards."
Who needs a medal from the Queen when the company want to make you that poster boy for the daring do?
Below the main titles was a subheading. Company-sponsored event this July to receive biggest televised audience so far.
Here. Looking for a missing brother.
He turned away and began hanging his religious clothing in the appropriate parts of his storage unit. She got up and stood behind him.
Wouldn't it be funny if we send them a little award of our own on their special day, with the eyes of the world are watching? His pretty head.
The martyr sprang round like a scalded cat, gripping her by the forearms and throwing her against the wall, holding her in place there with his own body. She smiled, a thick, dirty smile, liking this reaction, liking it very much.
Let him look around the island. Let him leave. And don't ever speak of this again.
He stood back, letting her fall clumsily from the wall. Unable to bear to look at her any longer, he left her alone in his room. She slid back down onto his bed, searching for the smell of him in his sheets. Above her on the windowsill was an old memento of a beach holiday, the possession of some former holidaymaker from a time in the sun many years ago. A snow globe, but rather than depicting a festive scene, the landscape enclosed within the plastic dome was of a beach with ragged cliffs, overbearing dunes, and a small, tumble-down shack at one side. Eva chewed on a piece of her hair and shook the globe violently, whipping up a frenzied storm of sand and stones that rushed over the plastic-painted landscape with frightening speed and canonical proportions.